is Melissa Gerson. I am the clinical director of Columbus Park, which is an outpatient treatment center for eating disorders in New York City. Clearly not very technologically inclined. I'm sorry we're 10 minutes late and having some little momentary jitters here with our technology, but we're here now. And I'm very excited to be here with my friend and colleague, Marissa Sappho, who is the founder and the director of Aurora Behavioral Health in New York City, which is also a treatment center for eating disorders. So we're gonna chat with Marissa today, but first I'm gonna set us up for our therapeutic meal. So this hour is going to replicate treatment center meal support. So we're gonna go through the process together and I'm gonna talk you through. So right now is a great time if you have any friends or people that you think might benefit from this hour, please feel free to invite or tag people. The more the merrier. And also it's a good time to have your meal ready in front of you. Hopefully you brought a meal today. If you didn't, we've done maybe 18 to 20 of these live meal supports, and they're all in our library at my3square.com. So you can feel free to use one a day for the next few weeks during a meal, whether it's your lunch meal or your dinner meal, and you can kind of come along with us and go through an hour of a meal support session at your leisure. So I'm gonna start with checking in about our meal components, because when we join together in person for a therapeutic meal, that's pretty much the first thing that we do. So each person kind of goes around the table and shares the meal that they chose, and they share how they know the meal is balanced and going to meet their needs. So they may highlight different components in their meal that will meet their nutritional needs. And so I'm gonna do that for you now. We also share any thoughts or feelings we have about the meal, or we might share why we chose the meal in particular, what if the meal had any meaning in particular for us. So my meal today is I'm kind of getting boring because I keep doing sandwiches, mainly because it's just kind of hard to get other good food around here where I am. So my meal today is actually it's turkey and cheese, a turkey and cheese sandwich on bread with a handful of potato chips. And full disclosure, I'm starving. So as I've been getting ready for this this lunch meal, I've been picking at my potato chips. So I've had a few of them. But the way that I chose this meal is based on what was available in the house. I tend to like, a meat sandwich with a cheese, and I always end up putting honey mustard on it because I love honey mustard. So I took 2 slices of regular bread. I filled it with turkey and cheese today. So you can see, it's probably about, 3/4 of an inch of meat and cheese on the sandwich to make sure that I get enough protein. I kind of just threw on some honey mustard. I wasn't weighing my food or measuring at all. I just kind of used a few slices so that it's a robust sandwich, a decent sized sandwich. Then for my potato chips, I just reached my hand in the bag. I grabbed a handful. I threw it on the plate. And then today I grabbed a little extra because I'm especially hungry today. And then today I just have my seltzer club soda to drink with my meal. And this meal I know is very satisfying for me. I kind of have a sense ahead of time, because I've had a similar meal to this so many times before, that I kind of know how my body feels about this meal, and that I will be able to complete this meal fully within the 30-minute time frame. And I'm sure I'm going to feel very comfortably full. I won't feel overly full at all. And usually I notice with this meal, I'm often kind of craving something sweet at the end. So sometimes I'll go and if I can, I'm going to go to the kitchen and grab some dessert of some sort. And I probably do that almost every day, probably at least 5 days a week. I grab a dessert afterwards. Marissa, welcome. I know you brought a meal today too, so maybe you can share with everybody what you brought, the components, does it have a protein component, carbohydrate, adequate fat? How did you come to the meal? Share with us.
Yeah, of course. So in general, meal planning for me takes on a lot of different forms depending on the day, and I really try to follow more of an intuitive eating model. For people who are in recovery, virtual meal support, in-person meal supports are so important because I see intuitive eating as the goal, as the long-term goal, the end result. But I think it can be very hard when you're just starting in recovery to start with intuitive eating. And I think that there can be a lot of safety in structure and learning, trying to relearn what balanced components look like. So now that I'm, much more of an intuitive eater, my meals change from day to day, depending on how I'm feeling, on what my body needs that day. And I also try to think about other things like, what else have I eaten today? Or what am I going to have for dinner tonight? What have I been doing over the last week? So this morning I had sort of a lighter breakfast because I was up really early for a meeting and then I was in back-to-back sessions. So I wanted to give myself a little bit of a heartier meal. And I will attempt to show it to you right now. Hopefully, we'll see how this works turning my computer. I don't know.
There you go. Oh, wow. I'm impressed. That's beautiful.
Yay. Okay. So yeah. I'll give you a little walkthrough of what we've got here. So I have, and sorry, it's a little shaky. I'm holding it with.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So just to put my hand next to it here so you can see a little bit for size comparison, just like Melissa was saying, I don't do any like specific measuring, portioning. I don't have measuring cups out. I don't have food scales. I don't, sometimes I eyeball things, sometimes not. Sometimes I just go with what I'm feeling. And I always tell myself that I can have less or more than what I portion, that I try to really go based on hunger, fullness, and satiety cues, which is something that, I think all of us are working on in our meal supports. So here I have a chicken breast that was, I used an air fryer. I was very excited to get it. I did an air fried chicken breast with something called Nando sauce, which is sort of like a garlicky, spicy sauce, which I really love. I made some sweet potato fries here. And then here I have some crispy broccoli and crispy mushrooms. And probably in the afternoon, I'll have some other kind of snack in a few hours. Maybe I'll have like a cheese and an apple, something like that.
What a beautiful meal, Marissa. I'm so impressed. A lot of our guests have done these lovely meals, and I'm so envious because it reflects a little bit more creativity than I have, and also maybe more skill in the kitchen than I have, sadly. So that was beautiful. And I appreciate the palm so that we could kind of get a sense of the portioning. And I also, we've talked about this, about how one of the most important things I know for myself when I prepare meals for myself is that I want to know that they're going to be satisfying. And one of the ways that we get there is through added a fat component and a protein component. Having that balance of the fat and protein and carbohydrate, I know for me, keep me satiated. And then I kind of I'm better able to move on from the meal. I'm not moving on from the meal feeling like, oh, I feel like I need something else that didn't quite do it for me. It really helps me cut down on my food related thoughts when I have a satisfying meal like that. So
the same for me, absolutely. And I can think about times where I've had, and we all have, right? Even when we're out of recovery and well on our way, fully recovered, wherever we are in the process, I can think about times where I have unbalanced meals, like let's say just a slice of pizza, plain cheese pizza. And it's delicious and I love it. But then I'm like looking for something else, like I'm not quite full enough. So when I round out the meal with, all the components, the protein, the fat, the nice veggies to give me some more fullness, get all those components in, it helps my satiety last longer.
Yeah, without question. And probably for you, and I know this is really true for me, and I think for many people out there, there's also comfort in knowing that the next time you get hungry, you'll be able to access food. Part of being an intuitive eater, and really an important part of recovery, is that faith and trust that when you're hungry, you're going to eat. And I think it cuts down, it sort of inoculates you against that instinctual feeling like you've got to get it while you can. That idea of like, if I don't eat it now, I know when I get hungry, I'm not going to be allowed, or if I don't get it now, later, it won't be available to me. And so I want to take in as much as I can. I mean, all of those emotions are so natural, and they're just such a natural response to deprivation. And you know, deprivation doesn't necessarily mean a starvation model. Deprivation is much more subtle than that. And I know, I like, for example, there was one night last week when I needed to go to the grocery, and we just did not have good food in the house for dinner. And I just was so picky. I kept picking, you know, I had something and then I had another thing, and I just couldn't get enough. And I just sort of felt like that little deprivation feeling of, I didn't get what I needed, I didn't get what I wanted, and now I just kind of want more. So you know, it's a little bit different than if I had told myself, well, no matter what later on, like, this is your meal and you better enjoy it because there's nothing coming later. Like that idea, that concept makes me anxious. If I really got that message, like, eat it now because later you're not going to have it, I would feel really anxious, and I'd probably eat much more now than I would, just knowing, you know, if I can put some Glad wrap over this, if I get full, and it'll be there for me if I want it later.
Yeah, you know, you're bringing up something that is so important. Absolutely. The idea of, this is going to be depleted. I won't have enough for myself. I won't have more and enough when I need it and want it later. And I need to get as much now and conserve resources. I hear that come up with patients all the time. Yeah. The other thing you said that's really important is the distinction between overt restriction and dietary restraint.
Yeah.
And restraint is that more subtle. It's, you know, restriction, we think about, I'm not eating anything, I'm only having, you know, one plain chicken breast with no oil, nothing, that's it. That's a very different idea than restraint, dietary restraint. Walking through the grocery store, for example, and saying, oh, that chocolate looks really yummy, but I shouldn't have it. That's not good for me. That makes me fat. I can't do that. And your cart might be filled up with food, but you're cutting back on things, and that also triggers those feelings of deprivation.
Yeah, I like the idea of the restraint being I shouldn't, or that's not okay, or that belongs in a bad, quote unquote, bad category. And sometimes restraint actually means that you're eating, but you just feel guilty about it, or you feel ashamed about it, which kind of brings me to a topic that we're going to talk about today. I'm starving, so I'm going to start eating now. And everybody, I'm going to, as we start eating, we're going to keep going with this conversation because I think it's a really good one. I'm going to set a little timer so that when we're halfway finished with the meal component, I'll let people know, in case anyone out there is working on pacing. I'm gonna let you know in 15 minutes when we're 15 minutes in, and then we're gonna try to eat within a 30-minute period, just so that we keep some containment. Oftentimes within an eating disorder, sometimes people might take a bit longer to eat their meal, or they might eat faster, and so oftentimes people are working on their pacing. So we're gonna set some structure for it. So we're thinking within 30 minutes. So I'm gonna let you know when we're halfway through, and then I'll let you also know when we have 5 minutes. And then one more thing I want to mention is usually after we check in on components, we set an intention for the meal. And the intention is just how you're going to go into the meal, something you're going to be thinking about, something you might be working on. And so I'm going to propose today that we practice self-compassion during the meal. So, and we're going to talk more about self-compassion today, but I want you to really try to treat yourself almost like you were the child version of you. You know, imagine, so if I'm Melissa, so imagine if there's like a 10-year-old Melissa or an 8-year-old Melissa eating this meal, and how would I talk to myself? Like, how would I support myself through it if little Melissa was having some anxiety or worry or feeling she was doing something bad? You know, how might I treat her, and how might I feed my child, and how would I nurture my child? And if you can think about that and try to sort of think about doing that toward yourself during the meal, I think that would be an interesting experiment. So we're going to start eating. Marissa, you were saying something that we were talking about restraint and
versus restriction,
and feeling shame and guilt about our eating. Now I'm forgetting my train of thought. But
you need to get some food in you first.
I think I need nourishment because I'm starving. So exactly. But I guess maybe this was my point now that I'm thinking about it. But I think what came up was shame.
Yeah.
And Marissa, I know that's a topic that you've you write about a lot. I know you've had groups about shame.
Yep.
Shame is just a huge concept within eating disorder work. And so maybe we can start with you kind of sharing some of your thoughts about shame and how you work with shame within the context of the treatment that you provide.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, I have not met any human being that hasn't experienced shameful moments. Secondly, I haven't met anybody with an eating disorder that hasn't had experiences where they're flooded with shame. And in an eating disorder, shame manifests in all different ways. Shame can be about body image and appearance. Shame can be about weight. Shame can be about feeling that you have failed or broken an eating disorder rule. Shame can be actually after a binge or a purge session and feeling ashamed of oneself. Shame manifests in all of these different ways. And what's really important to understand about shame is how insidious it is, how dangerous it is, how it erodes the core concept of ourself. It's the idea that we are ourself defective and worthless. It's a deeply rooted emotion that you are bad, you're wrong, you can't do anything right. It often includes and is linked with self-loathing feelings, a sense of deep inadequacy. And something that I like to make the distinction around is the difference between guilt and shame. So guilt gets a bad rap. Actually, guilt can be a really helpful emotion. Guilt comes up when you might have crossed a boundary, when you've done something wrong, when you've harmed somebody else, and it usually includes remorse and an attempt to make things better. It can actually be useful. It can draw our attention to something in ourselves that needs to be worked on. It can motivate us. To look more carefully at our values and commitments. It can kind of work like our conscience and our internal compass, a little bit of an internal governor. But shame is a totally different ballgame. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. I'm unlovable. I'm unworthy, right? And there are a few different things that we can do to combat that and kind of actively address it. We talk about some of the main parts of it are courage, compassion, and connection. The first is courage around being emotionally honest and vulnerable and speaking our truth, talking about our feelings. Shameful moments are especially hard to dialogue about. It's an odd thing, but talking about shame can feel more shaming. So it's really important that we talk about it in a space where the other person is receptive and open and can tolerate what we're talking about to help reduce that shame. The big thing is helping to develop that sense of self-compassion. Like you were talking about a little bit earlier, how can we be gentle with ourselves? And something that comes up, I find a lot with some of my patients, sometimes folks who are more on the restrictive end, is that there's a distorted idea about what self-compassion is. And sometimes people get worried or concerned that by expressing self-compassion, it means they are removing accountability or responsibility for actions or behaviors. And that is not at all what self-compassion is. Self-compassion doesn't mean, throwing your value system out and becoming completely blameless. But self-compassion does involve a gentleness. And, many people talk about mantras you can use, affirmations, things like that. I think those are all wonderful and really good things. But the truth is, when you are having those shameful thoughts, those judgmental thoughts, positive affirmations are not always the most helpful thing. They don't feel authentic.
And I think sometimes they can feel invalidating.
Exactly.
Because, a mantra like I am worthy in the moment where you feel so much shame about something you've done, it almost feels like there's not a match there. It feels empty. And it's almost like it invalidates the experience you're having.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. And so while I do think it's helpful for people to practice speaking to themselves in more loving ways, I think in those particular moments, especially when you're starting to practice building in self-compassion, that actually the first step would be curiosity. To turn inward a little bit, to do some self-inquiry and notice and observe the shameful thought and feeling that's coming up, and thinking a little bit about just notice what's happening now. Notice if you can, this is hard for some people too, notice if you can what's coming up in your body. If you're, having any kind of tension in your shoulders or tightness in your chest or pain in your belly or any place like that, just notice what's happening. And start to look for clues about what your shame trigger is. What inspired this? 5 minutes ago you were okay, and now all of a sudden you're feeling flooded with this feeling. And that's really one of the first steps.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to keep eating, so maybe.
Oh yeah, please. Please. Yeah, I think there's something so powerful when you're talking about noticing. I guess, you're talking about mindfulness, because, which is really important, because I think what happens often is that people might experience shame and may not even realize quite what's happening. It's almost like this sort of automatic reaction that comes over, and there may not in the moment be awareness of it, but what will happen is there might be certain behaviors that are associated with the shame.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so people end up maybe noticing the behaviors, but they may not actually notice the trigger to the behaviors. And so, like, for example, shame, I think, is often associated with some kind of avoidance behavior. So hiding in some way,
yes,
removing yourself from a situation, avoiding a situation. Oftentimes when we talk about eating, it can be avoiding food, avoiding a meal. And that can become so, like, there can be such a pattern of that behavior, yet without that mindfulness piece, you're really not recognizing why. And that there may be an element of shame that's the driver for a behavior that you might be trying to change, but haven't really made that connection. So I think it's worth it for people out there to kind of take a moment and reflect on whether any of their eating disorder symptoms or behaviors might have a core within shame, some way, feeling some sort of shame about yourself, some sort of shame about your body.
Yes, absolutely. So if we kind of think about that concept for a moment, I was thinking about this morning, this idea about how we start our mornings, how we start our day. A lot of my patients, this comes up pretty frequently anyway, but in particular now, a lot of my patients in the morning, some of the first things that they do, the first way that they begin their day is with very harsh, critical, negative self-talk and very shaming, judgmental language. I'm talking, and I'm not giving personal examples. I'm giving sort of
broad
brushstroke examples, but it's as a composite. So folks who, before they're even out of bed, when they wake up, the first thing they're body checking, and the first thought that comes into mind before their foot is on the floor is, oh, gross, I'm disgusting, all these terrible, unkind things. Or they then transition to, getting dressed, and they're putting on outfits in front of the mirror and spending a lot of time feeling all of these shameful feelings, feeling disgust about their body or their appearance, things like that. And to your point, shame can be an activating event, even though it's an emotion, be an activating event for behaviors. So You start your day in bed with your first thought, body checking how yucky you are. The next thing you do is walk to the mirror and spend 5 minutes telling yourself how unworthy you are, how disappointed you are in yourself, how terrible you are. What's going to happen when you go to the kitchen for breakfast?
Yeah. You can see the change, see the behavioral chain, you see the direct causal factors of eating behaviors gone wrong, right? So how those steps, that internal dialogue, and the way that internal dialogue leaves you feeling, without question, is immediately connected to how you care for yourself. And there's one other thing I want to note. What we see often in anorexia is kind of like this little flip experience where someone might wake up in the morning engaging in behaviors to avoid shame, to avoid experiencing their body, to try to make their bodies as small as possible. And there's a feeling of empowerment that sometimes goes with it, that in some ways I think is almost like the flip side of shame.
You're
right?
absolutely correct. There's you hit, Melissa, this is why
I should do this for a living. Thank you, Marissa.
It amazes me. I can't believe I've known you like over a decade. I just love it. And I have to say again, I'm so impressed with everything you're doing. And
thank you so much.
I'm grateful to be a part of this, but I'm also so grateful for our community that you're offering this, and for everybody that's been involved. It's just so needed right now. And I love that we can all collaborate and work together to take care of each other, because now is really the time for that.
Thank you, Marissa.
Of course. But you're absolutely right. It is sort of like a flip piece. There's something in eating disorders, there's the shame component. There's also the pride component, symptom pride.
Yep. Symptom pride. Yep. And the vacillating between the two all day, right? Moments of pride, based around sometimes not the most health promoting things. So for example, pride when you've restricted, or pride when you see a certain number on the scale, or right? Pride with a skipped meal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you said something so important when we were starting off about the intention setting, and I love that. That's something we also do at Aurora. We set an intention for every meal, and the intention of self-compassion. And so, as you're eating your meal, if you're struggling, you said something really great, this idea of thinking about your younger self. Now, that's a great one, right? How would you talk to and treat
a child,
your 10-year-old, your 8-year-old self, your 6-year-old self?
Yeah. Just so we're halfway through the eating component, but don't worry, Marissa, you're talking much more. So don't worry, you can have a little extra time at the end.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
No pressure.
This is also why I didn't do a salad, because anybody that's ever done a meal support with me, all my patients know this about me, everyone knows, it takes me so long to eat a salad. It takes me probably a full hour to eat a salad. So I know.
That's so validating, I'm sure, to so many listeners, because sometimes it just takes a long time. It's okay. It doesn't mean it's an eating disorder, right? Yeah.
So I specifically said no salad today. I won't have enough time to get through it. So sometimes, it's hard for folks to think about their younger self and hold compassion even for a younger self. Ideally, if we can do that, that's great. But sometimes I'll do it even more abstract. Can you think about if this is a pet, or
I like that.
Yeah. Everyone that knows Aurora,
great alternative.
knows our little pug Stella, so I use her as a really good example, right? That I would never, under or overfeed her. How would I talk to her? What would I say to her if she's struggling, right? And thinking about that self-compassion, treating yourself with love and care, right? Treating yourself the way you would treat a best friend, the way you would treat your pet that you love so much, and eventually the way that you could treat your younger, more infantile self. But sometimes it takes steps to get there.
You know, excuse me. What I think is so important to realize about that, you know, I think there's some analogy to a good coach, bad coach, a nice coach, mean coach. I think that's the one where
Yeah.
you think about if you're a coach and you have a little league team that you're coaching and trying to, you want the kids to do their best, and you'd be great if you could win the tournament. And you think about there's two coaches in this scenario, and one of the coaches is like, just mean as can be, and he's constantly like down on the kids and saying mean things and belittling them and barking at them, and really just sending these horrible messages to these poor kids on one team. And then the other team has a coach who's supportive and like having fun and being just really reinforcing. And whenever somebody does something, like whenever a kid shows skill or effort in the game, they get like a pat on the back. And then I want you to like think about which team do you think is going to perform better. And I think most people, when they answer that question, will say, well, of course, the team of the nice coach, because the kids are propped up, like they feel good about themselves. And when you feel good about yourself, you generally perform better. And so I think we have to really be mindful of that in ourselves, because I think everybody out there, all of us, we want to perform well, and whatever it is that we're doing, of course, like that's human nature. You want to perform well. And especially we want to perform well in our recovery. We want to move forward. We want to, take care of ourselves. And so, it's so important to really connect with that idea of how am I really going to motivate myself? How am I going to encourage myself? How am I going to direct myself to engage in behaviors, actions that are like positive, that I view as positive, as opposed to beating myself up. And what if you're beating yourself up a lot all the time, what is going to be the result? What is your performance going to look like overall?
Yes. And so I love this idea about the sort of like good coach, bad coach. And if we're thinking about the good coach who's supportive and encouraging, what does the good coach say and do when maybe a correction needs to take place?
Yeah.
So if you're in the middle of your support, right, and you're struggling to do something, the bad coach is the one that comes in and says, oh, you're such a mess up. What's wrong with you? Get it together. This should be easy. Always watch out for those shoulds, right?
Yeah, that is a first sign.
Those are those judgment words, right? You've had so many meal supports. You should be able to just breeze through this. What a disappointment, right? That's the bad coach. And then maybe on your other shoulder, you've got your eating disorder voice going, yeah, we're really winning now. This is this.
Yeah.
But the good coach has to offer gentle correction, right? Compassionate correction, which again is very much related to mindfulness and self-inquiry. Just gently turning attention towards the problem. I see that you're really having trouble. You're struggling right now at saying it to yourself. I notice that I'm having a hard time eating the sweet potato fries. Why? What's coming up for me? Why might that be?
Being curious, and
Tell me what's scaring me about this right now? How can I challenge that? How can I make space in the middle? Because I think, with self-compassion, this is really important. It's about finding a middle space between holding yourself accountable in a non-rigid way, right? And also being gentle around our sensitivities and our edges. And so there might be some meals that are really challenging, and maybe you don't do 100% completion. That's a moment for self-compassion, right?
Yeah.
of course, you're working with your team to make sure you're meeting your nutritional needs, but that's a moment for self-compassion instead of self-criticism, to be curious about what happened in that meal and use it as data to inform something for yourself.
It just made me think about how it's important to use self-compassion for good instead of evil. Yes. And so let's be really honest with ourselves, and I think as we're teaching about self-compassion, I think we're hoping that folks out there are not going to use self-compassion for the eating disorder and say, I'm going to be kind to, I restricted my meal today, so it's okay that I restricted. I mean, I think that's kind of a, maybe a rule of thumb for using self-compassion is that self-compassion is about concern for your genuine well-being.
Correct.
And so it really doesn't make sense if it's in service of hurting yourself. It's really it's a really overarching concept that it's there for your general well-being, just as, when you're talking to your pet, when you're thinking about your pug, your pug, it's really thinking about, is this really in service of what's your pug's name? Della. Is this really in service of Della's health and well-being? Or, is it in service of something else?
Yes.
So I think that's really good. And the other thing I want to say is I love that you reminded us about the component of the tough coach, nice coach, about how, you don't have to be some kind of like Pollyanna cheerleader for yourself. I mean, that's not what this is about, because sometimes there's a need for correction. I mean, sometimes there's really a need for redirection. The little league kids, sometimes they're not getting it right. They're there to learn. They're there to grow. Like, that's part of why they're participating, because they want to enhance their skill set. And so the good coach, the kind coach, is there about, how do I enhance the skill set? How do I better these kids? How do I help them to grow and to develop? So I'm so glad you brought that up about, it's not just blind cheerleading. It's about shaping yourself in a way that's really nurturing and about really caring for your health and your well-being more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And, you really hit the nail on the head, because that self-compassion is taking care of yourself. And it doesn't mean losing accountability. And it also doesn't mean overly permissive.
Yep. Great point.
Some examples they give when people talk about self-care, which is related to self-compassion, but it's a little different, is that sometimes there's a sneaky part of us that can masquerade as self-care, but it's not really self-care.
Yeah.
Self-care needs, just like self-compassion, needs to exist in this kind of middle space where there's some boundaries and some accountability. Self-care and self-compassion don't mean no rules, do anything I want and feel. The same way intuitive eating, when in its actual purest form, the way it was designed, doesn't just mean do whatever I feel whenever with nothing guiding me. There are principles that guide it that you about. And that's
5 more minutes for eating portion.
Sure. And that's the same, with our self-compassion and our self-kindness. We whether it's our eating disorder or some other part of ourself, we may want to do something. We may want to engage in a behavior, or we may want to avoid. And we may say, well, I've had such a long day. I'm so tired. I don't really want to make a whole meal. Maybe I could just throw a few snacks together and that'll be good enough for my dinner. Right. And there's a part that can feel like that's the self-compassionate thing to do because you're tired and it's hard. Right.
Yeah.
Real self-compassion says sometimes we have to do things that are a little bit hard anyway, because that's what's taking care of ourselves. And so
I think that adds on to the coach, like the coach knows what's in your best interest,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like you might have to do some of the drills, because even though the little league kids complain about it, they might have to do the drills because it's going to get them stronger or more skillful in their playing. I'm like totally going with coach analogy.
No, I love it. I love it. If anybody has sat through Super Soccer Stars, my goodness, that at least the first half just drills.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But I think it's really helpful, Marissa, the way you're helping us kind of work through some, like, poke holes a little bit in self-compassion. So we know, again, that we're acting in the service of good as opposed to evil. And it's so tricky in an eating disorder because there's so many there's these conflicting sides that are in constant kind of struggle with one another. So it's hard to really keep your eye, your eye on actually what is really truly going to be like nurturing for yourself. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think that's a really great point. And I think that's also why, again, eating disorder expert to eating disorder expert, I feel that especially in early stages of recovery, you need support and help from people who can help you parse that out, who can help you discern and decipher what is self-compassion versus what is colluding with the eating disorder, what is being flexible versus what is a harmful behavior.
Yeah, that's so well said. So well said, Marissa. I had a thought of an exercise that might be helpful to people. But actually first, just to let everybody know where we are in terms of the meal component, remind me where I left off, that I want to do a little exercise. But more or less, we're kind of at that 30-minute mark of the meal. And so if you're not finished with your meal, it means you were talking a lot. So you got distracted maybe, which is totally cool, totally okay. It could also mean that your pacing is on the slower side, and it might be worth kind of thinking about whether this is something pacing is something you want to target. If it will get in your way, if completing a meal takes more than 30 minutes, will that get in the way of your life? Is there a downside to that? And if so, it might be good to think about pacing. And when I eat during these meals, and again, we have hours and hours of these sessions. If you feel like going back and taking a look, when I eat, I'm trying to be mindful of my pace. And so I sometimes advise people out there to consider kind of matching my pace if they're working on it. But I finished my meal. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. So at the end of a meal, I don't know about at Aurora, but at Columbus Park, we always kind of check in on how did we feel about the meal? How are we feeling kind of emotionally? I really liked my meal. I definitely I wanted more chips. So I noticed I like to take like a bite of sandwich, a bite of chip, and then I ran out of chips. So I was a little disappointed. So in the moment I wanted more, but it's funny because now I'm kind of satisfied. Like I'm not stuffed or anything, but I'm totally, totally comfortable. I feel like in a good place to be able to focus on my next activities because I'm feeling satisfied. I'm not feeling uncomfortably full, and just sort of feel ready to move on. But I want to share, since we're talking about shame, I want to share something kind of funny that I noticed when we, at the very beginning of the series. It was my first couple of times doing this video thing where, we get, all of us, I mean, it's so amazing how critical we can be of ourselves. And so when I watched my first video, I had like some critiques about myself, I should have been this, I should have been that. So I needed to kind of get connected with that critic in my head. But one of the things that I noticed is that, and I remember this particular installment, I was really hungry. Came in really hungry, and the meal was really good. It was like pasta with meat sauce, and I loved this meal, and I was really hungry, starving. And when I watched myself on the tape, for a moment I was embarrassed because I was like, I actually know I was eating really fast, and so I wasn't being mindful of my pace for everybody who was watching out there. I was just kind of eating, and every time I would like lean in and open my mouth with the pasta going into my mouth, and I felt like, for a second, I felt shame about my eating, and that it was on video, and I was like kind of eating like fast and maybe not, just not, I don't know, it almost looked like bad manners or something. And I felt like uneasy inside, and I went to bed that night. And the next morning I woke up with this totally different perspective. And I was like, oh my God, look at that. Look at how I fell for that for some reason, why do I think I have to be some prim and proper? Like, I don't know if you saw Downton Abbey, that the Netflix series, and there's so much food and they eat like, oh my God. I mean, they take the tiniest little bites and they put it delicately in their mouth, and they, it's like barely chewing anything. And And I was like, do I need to eat like the Downton Abbey people? I mean, look, I mean, I'm a woman, I'm hungry. I was hungry in that moment. I was enjoying my food, you know, screw it. Like, and it's just like the shame melted away. In some
Mhm.
way, I just connected with this idea of like, why do I have to conform to some sort of standard or, because I think shame comes up so much when we feel like we have to fit into a mold. I was like, what mold is that? And I spent my whole career, my whole life kind of fighting that in a way that we in some way are supposed to be so restrained or in control. Like, and so I don't know, I just want to share that I did have that momentary shame. There was a little bit of like this judgment voice, but then that I kind of came around to it and almost like turned it into an empowering moment where I kind of embraced that there was something that I did for a moment that I got locked into, maybe a story in my head, something I picked up from my culture, my environment about who I'm supposed to be. And
Mhm.
it turned on a recording in my head around having done something wrong until I reconnected with my own personal values and
Yes.
who I want to be and who I am now. And I realized no, like I'm not going to go there and experience shame around fueling myself and doing it with gusto.
Yes, yes. That's, I think that was beautifully stated. And it's something that comes up in shame is the vulnerability. And it's something that came up for me even in doing this, right? I'm thinking, oh my goodness, like what meal would I prepare and where am I going to put the computer? And,
Yeah.
my patients might see this, other patients might see it, my colleagues might see it. What will they think of me? Will I do a good job? All of
Yeah.
those, all that vulnerability is sort of ripe for the shameful feelings to come in. And how we challenge that is in part, what you did. You really sort of walked yourself through this. What do I have to be ashamed about? I enjoyed my meal. I provided a service, right? My values are not consistent with taking micro bites,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's not who I want to be. That's not how I
Yeah.
want to show up in this world.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it is connecting with values, which is maybe a helpful thing to think about with self-compassion and trying to, recognize your own shame is, really what do you value in this world? Who do you value in this world? Like, are you falling into societal messages and stories that you've learned, from your environment, or can you come out of that and just really connect with who you are and what's important to you? Because I think oftentimes what people who have eating disorders will say is this is I would never deny my friend. I would never body shape and weight in my friends and people I love and care about, that doesn't come in at all. I don't care about that. That's not a factor, but it's different for me. Or I would never deny my friend enjoying dessert or eating a meal with gusto. Like I would be happy for them. I would respect it. But for myself, it's not okay. So I think it's important to recognize like your own story, your own rules for yourself, what you expect yourself to conform to, and does that really match your broader view about the world? And if there's an inconsistency, how do you make sense of that? How do you kind of work through that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And Brene Brown, who's done so much shame work, she talks about two concepts. She talks about one concept for I'll say that I'll preface it by saying it's pretty gendered and heteronormative
Mm,
idea. So
yeah.
take it as you
Yeah.
will. That's the caveat. But the idea that women are caught in these webs. And the way I think of it is that women in the 21st century are expected to be everything to everyone all of the time.
Mm,
So you have to perform perfectly on every level. You have to have a successful career, and you have to look a certain way, and you have to be a great wife and mother and homemaker. You have to do
yeah.
everything now. So you're stuck on this big web, and whichever direction you move, there's some other cultural message that you're getting about who you should be, what you should be doing, and the ways that you're not measuring up. Um, for men, she talks about men being in small boxes, that they're boxed into something very narrow with society's demands and expectations. And I think, again, exactly as you're describing, trying to think about the ways that you're trapped in your own small box or your own sticky web,
Mm,
and look more towards your own personal values as
yeah,
opposed to external things that are trying to dictate who you are. And this is, of course, really tricky for our perfectionists, and I count
yeah,
myself as one
yeah,
of them.
yeah. Yeah, and people with eating disorders are highly perfectionistic. I mean, it's one
Mhm.
of the vulnerabilities that it's what makes folks vulnerable to eating disorders is that perfectionism. So,
Yeah.
but I really love that. Before we close, a couple of quick things. One is um, at the end of the meal, we often will check in on how we're feeling, and we check in on the meal component and how, like, sort of physically and emotionally how we're feeling. But I also want to note that we very quickly move on to kind of buttoning up. Actually, we want to not bring out so much feeling because we want to function. We want to be able to move on with our lives after the meal, and not be thinking about food and trying to feel like we have a sense of steady when we leave. So often we very quickly move on to a skill, a strategy, coping ahead for the afternoon. How are we gonna take care of ourselves? And so we usually teach a skill. I don't know that this is a skill so much, although we've been talking about the skill of self-compassion for this whole segment. So hopefully folks out there will take something back with them. But I have a little exercise that people can do, and I think this can be really enlightening when we think about our critic. And it's kind of a fun exercise. So the idea is that you write a job description for your critic, your internal critic. So when you write this job description, you're thinking about, what is the critic's purpose in your life? What is the job? So, like, is it to keep you safe? Is it to keep you free of pain? Is it to motivate you? Is it to punish you? How does it do that job? Does it call you names? Does it use the should and shouldn't? Does it starve you? Does it stuff you? How does it do this critic job? And also thinking about how well is it doing its job. Give it a little job performance review. Is it really doing its job well? And also really thinking about, is it really achieving what it set out to do? So if one of the tasks or responsibilities of the critic is to, like, motivate you, because I think people connect a lot with that. Like, I need that critical voice to keep me in shape, to keep me in line. If it really is, if that's its job, is it doing it well? How successful is it? Give it that little bit of performance review, and realize that some of the job duties are positive. Like, yeah, we want to be safe, we want to be free of pain, we want to be motivated. And that some of the job duties are really are not so positive. Like, I punish myself. I think a lot of people connect with that idea that inner critic is the punisher. And so, but then after you create this job description and do your performance review of the critic, maybe take a few minutes to think about the more nurturing and positive coach that we touched on today. And what would that job description look like? And what would the job responsibilities be? Really trying to describe as explicitly as possible, what does it do? Does it have a mantra, and is it a cheerleader, or does it sort of treat you more like you would your animal or your child? Does it nurture you with anything in particular? For example, certain self-care behaviors. So kind of try as much as you can to map out that more compassionate job, and see if you could find a place for that character in your psyche. And like any skill or new behavior, it takes practice. So maybe to think about, what are some safe start, like nice person, nice voice or kind voice, compassionate voice 101. Where do they start, and is there a place where they can start that doesn't feel too threatening? So if finding a more compassionate voice around food feels too threatening or scary, or you maybe don't feel quite ready, maybe you can try to harness that compassionate voice around like your work or your school performance, or even something like making your bed in the morning, can you just practice that new job and see, what it says and how it talks and what's the tone, just to begin to isolate it and start to build it.
Yes. Beautiful. I love it.
Well, Marissa, thank you. It was so good to see you today. One of my favorite parts of this Meet and Eat series is that I get to see all these fantastic, incredible people that I might not normally get to see, especially when we're so isolated. So it's so nice to see you, Marissa Sappho from Aurora Behavioral Health. And I enjoyed all of you participating today. On Monday, we have a fun hour planned with Jessica DeMasi, who's, if you Google her, you'll see she's a very outspoken supporter of the non-diet movement, and can be crass and a little bit.
She's spirited.
She's spirited, exactly. So I'm really excited, and I think it'll be really inspiring and fun. So I hope folks out there can join us on Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And I hope you all have a compassionate day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa.